Welcome to this video on understanding your legal landscape. My name is Joel Christensen. I'm with the Community Development Unit of Alberta Culture, Multiculturalism, and Status of Women. Before I begin, I'd like to mention that the goal of our board development video series is for board members of nonprofit organizations to have the basic knowledge, skills, and tools to be successful in their work. We realize that some of you are not board members, and that's fine. But we want you to be aware that the information, concepts, and ideas presented are from the board member perspective. Also, the information presented here is aimed at an introductory level or as a refresher for board members to ensure that they have the base level understanding of board governance concepts and principles needed to successfully do their work. We do have other resources that we can share with you, such as our toolkit. There is a link in the description of this video to our toolkit that provides additional resources and links that we think are helpful for you and your nonprofit organization as you tackle your governance issues. Included in this toolkit is a copy of the slides we use in this video and all the videos in our board development video series. You can also hit the subscribe button down below and turn on the notification to subscribe to our YouTube channel and get notification about our upcoming videos. The last thing I want to mention before we get going is that in this video, we are not providing advice. The information offered in this video and the related materials are not intended to constitute legal advice, the rendering of legal concepts, consulting, or other professional services of any kind. We simply want to share with you information that we think will be helpful for board members as you navigate your organization through its governance and operations. By the end of this video, you will be able to identify external and internal rules of nonprofit organizations, explain the main legal documents that are important to nonprofit organizations, indicate who is responsible for creating, approving, and changing those legal documents, and explain the relationship between them. You'll be able to explain incorporation and different types of nonprofit organizations, explain why it is important to know your incorporation status and what are some legislations that not-for-profits need to be aware of, explain CRA registration and how it is different from incorporation. So let's get going. The first thing I want to discuss is the big picture of the rules that nonprofit organizations need to be aware of and the framework that they need to operate in. The first one is external rules. These rules include laws that nonprofit organizations must follow. Like all ordinary people, nonprofit organizations must obey the law. But nonprofit organizations must also follow internal rules. These rules include the organization's objects, bylaws, policies, procedures, and customs. These are the rules that are made by the organizations themselves. Therefore, nonprofit organizations need not only to follow external rules, but their own rules as well. I will discuss internal rules in more detail later on in the video. How do the pieces fit together? The core legal documents for nonprofit organizations incorporated under the Alberta Societies Act include legislation, regulations, objects, bylaws, policies, and procedures. You can see these documents in this graphic we call the ladder of authority. On the left side of the ladder are the external rules, which include legislation and regulations. And on the right side of the ladder, we have internal rules, which include objects, bylaws, policies, and procedures. Overall, the ladder of authority shows three things. It displays all the documents that form the legal framework of nonprofit organizations incorporated under the Alberta Societies Act. These are named on top of each step in the graphic. The ladder names the group who has authority for each document. This is found underneath the document on each step. And the ladder also provides some information about the relationship between each step in the ladder. Each step on the ladder cannot contradict the rules set out in the document on the step above it. For example, we have regulations on the ladder of authority. Underneath that same step, we have public officials, which means that the regulations are created by public officials. Above regulations on the ladder, we have legislation. And this means that we cannot have a regulation that contradicts any information in the legislation. The more familiar you are with these legal documents, the more you will understand what rules your organization has and how your organization should get its work done. Now let's start by explaining legislation. To know more about legislation, the first thing we need to know is incorporation. Incorporation is the legal process by which an organization formally becomes a legal person. In other words, becomes a legal society. This means that when an organization is incorporated, it is given legal status that is similar to the status of an individual person. The Societies Act is an example of legislation. It defines certain requirements for organizations and certain rules that organizations must follow. For example, Section 6 of the Societies Act requires that organizations that are incorporated under the Alberta Societies Act must submit a name when they submit their application for incorporation. This is an external rule that you must follow. Here is an example of a certificate of incorporation for the Alberta Societies Act. As you see, there is a stamp of incorporation at the bottom right, but also a corporate access number assigned to the organization and the date it was incorporated under. This will look different under other acts or legislation that you may be incorporated under, but this is what it looks like to be incorporated under the Alberta Societies Act. Now we want to spend a little bit of time on the differences between the three types of nonprofit organizations: unincorporated associations, nonprofit corporations, and trusts. An unincorporated association is a group of individuals that come together for a common purpose. They have no legal identity separate from the people who make up that association. There is no specific legislation to govern unincorporated associations or to protect the individuals involved in it. Therefore, individuals involved in unincorporated associations are subject to federal and provincial laws, as well as recent and relevant legal decisions of the courts. Some of these laws include contract law, employment standards, tax laws, and human rights legislation. A nonprofit corporation is an organization that has incorporated under a statute, and therefore it is a separate legal entity. A nonprofit corporation is created when the founders of an organization complete the necessary steps of the incorporation process. When incorporation is complete, the nonprofit organization gains its own separate legal identity, and it can be described as a separate legal person. The incorporated organization is referred to as a nonprofit corporation. It is independent of its board members and is responsible for its own debts and obligations. In a nonprofit corporation, the liability of the board members is limited because the corporation exists as a unique legal entity. Now, the term corporation can be confusing because it is usually used with private organizations whose main goal is to generate profit. However, in this case, it refers to the incorporation process that creates a separate legal entity for an organization. But why would you want to become a legal entity? Well, when your organization incorporates and becomes a legal entity, it can protect you as a board member from being sued. You might think that your organization doesn't need that formal legal status. For example, there are some coffee clubs and walking clubs around us, unincorporated associations. They meet regularly, they go for their coffees, they go for their walks regularly. They see no reason to become incorporated because that's mainly what they do, and they do not need to have that level of protection. There are some reasons to incorporate, but keep in mind, one of the key parts of incorporation as a nonprofit is that your liability as a board member is limited, and that's an important consideration for board members. For example, as a decision maker or board member of an unincorporated coffee club, if something happens in one of those coffee meetings and you are not incorporated, the board members are personally liable for what happens. However, if they were incorporated, the organization as a separate legal entity would be responsible. Individual board members are mostly protected. Now, I say mostly because you can still be liable as a board member. Incorporation does not protect you against negligence, but it does provide a first level protection that, as an organization or a group, you may want to have. There are other reasons to incorporate. For example, funders may require it. So to receive funding, you may need to be a nonprofit corporation. Another reason is that it may convey legitimacy in your community and your area. People recognize your organization in the community as a legitimate organization that they want to be a part of, or that they want to donate to and support. One other benefit is that as a result of that legitimacy, membership in your organization could be more attractive for similar reasons. So these are some of the reasons you may want to be incorporated. The last type of nonprofit organization are trusts. A trust is a type of legal relationship created when one or more people, called trustees, hold legal title to property, but another person or persons has the right to enjoyment or benefit from that property. The powers and duties of the trustees can be found in the trust document and in provincial trustees legislation. Trustees need to be aware of the contents of the trust document and the Provincial Trustee Act, because they could be held responsible and liable for the decisions they make and for their behavior in their positions as trustees. We will not go into too much more detail about what a trust is, but the key thing is just understanding that there are some organizations that own property or physical spaces that they manage for the benefit of others. There is a group in Edmonton called the Trust for Ending Homelessness in Edmonton. They own property where people in need are housed. This trust manages the physical building to benefit the tenants. So these are three base types of nonprofit organizations to be aware of. What is your corporate status? I think most of you will probably say a nonprofit corporation under the Societies Act of Alberta. But just to be aware, there are other legislations that you can incorporate under. Let's delve into these a little more. The Societies Act regulates nonprofit societies incorporated in Alberta. 5 or more people can form a society for the purposes such as benevolent, philanthropic, charitable, provident, scientific, artistic, literary, social, educational, agricultural, sporting, or another useful purpose. Creating a separate identity from their members and limiting the liability of board members are some of the most important benefits for incorporation, as you recall from our discussion earlier. Additionally, the organization gains a more permanent and credible status and can continue its work even if the membership changes. The Alberta Societies Act is also one of the simplest and least costly incorporation options for nonprofit organizations. Another option for incorporation, nonprofit companies, can gain incorporation status under the Alberta Companies Act, Part 9. In this case, they are called nonprofit companies. Nonprofit companies are usually formed to promote art, science, religion, charity, or other similar purposes. They can also be formed solely for the purpose of promoting recreation for their members. Nonprofit companies also become legal entities separate from their members and provide some legal protection and limited liability for their board members. However, the most important benefit of incorporating as a nonprofit company is that the organization can carry on a trade or business to gain profit and then use that profit to promote the purpose of the organization. It is important to note that although these nonprofit organizations operate a company for profit, the profits can only be used for promoting the purpose and objectives of the organization. In other words, the profits will not be paid to members. Nonprofit organizations across Canada, including Alberta, can incorporate federally under the Canada Non-for-Profit Corporations Act, or CNCA. Federal incorporation means that the organization can operate across Canada using its corporate name. The majority of the rules of the CNCA came into force on October 2011, and they are more modern, flexible, and designed specifically for nonprofits. In addition to their regular benefits of incorporation mentioned earlier in this module, incorporation under CNCA can give name protection to the organization. The organization also has a degree of flexibility regarding where registered offices can be located, where corporate records are maintained, and where annual meetings are held. Federal nonprofit corporations are also recognized around the world as Canadian corporations. There are several other incorporation options for nonprofits in Alberta. Some of them include Alberta Agricultural Societies Act, the Alberta Libraries Act, the Religious Societies Land Act, as well as other special acts of the legislature that nonprofit organizations can choose from. To choose the best incorporation option, it is important to consider the activities of the organization, the clients it serves, and their needs. If the organization is not an incorporated group and board members are involved in forming a new nonprofit, it is best to consult a lawyer or a professional advisor to ensure which incorporation option best meets the needs of the group and the community. What does your birth certificate say? The example of the Certificate of Incorporation under the Societies Act is what we often refer to as a birth certificate. And so if you're unsure about whether or not you have one of those, you can apply and get a search for your organization from corporate registry and any registry office. Why is it important to know if we are incorporated or not? First, the statute sets out the powers of the board and a number of rules that the organization must follow to operate and remain in good standing as a corporation. Second, the duties and responsibilities of board members will vary depending on which statute is used. Therefore, board members need to read the statute that governs their organization carefully to know about these obligations. When a nonprofit incorporates, it receives a certificate of incorporation, which can be considered as its birth certificate. So if you don't already know what is written on your birth certificate, make sure you try to find out which act you do fall under. You need to know your act because it's your first set of parameters or rules that you need to follow. Many of you may have heard about following objects, bylaws, policies, and procedures that you make yourself and you need to follow. But sometimes we pay less attention to the importance of knowing the act that we're under. They are also a set of rules that you must follow, and they are just as important as bylaws, policies, procedures that we cover later in this video. So we have talked about incorporation legislation, but what other legislation do we need to be aware of? One that we really want you to be aware of is the Income Tax Act. It's a federal act, and you may say, well, I thought we were income tax exempt as a non-for-profit. Yes, that's true. Nonprofits are tax exempt, but you still need to file an annual return. The other one is the Charitable Fundraising Act, and this is a provincial act in Alberta. It is important to know that you must register as a charitable organization in Alberta if you intend to raise more than $25,000 in gross contributions and solicitations from Albertans in one financial year. You must also register as a charitable organization if you use the services of a fundraising business, or if you happen to raise $25,000, even if this was not planned. If this happens, you can still register your organization after the event. For more information, go to your toolkit and review the information we have there about the Alberta Charitable Fundraising Act. These are a couple of examples of legislation you need to be aware of, but it is important for you to know that there may be other specific legislation that guide the work of your organization depending on what your organization does or if it has assets. Incorporation and charity status. What's the difference? This is also another important bit of information that we want you to know. We've talked a lot about incorporation, but you also have Canada Revenue Agency, or CRA, registration as a registered charity. The differences between them is quite significant. Incorporation includes choosing the incorporation legislation that is right for your organization and following the rules that are set out in the legislation. but registering as a charity does not give you corporate status. When you incorporate under the Societies Act, you are allowed to follow many different purposes for your organization. These purposes are benevolent, philanthropic, charitable, providence, scientific, artistic, literary, social, educational, agricultural, sporting, or other useful purpose, but not for the purpose of carrying on a trade or business. So you have a lot of different options that you can follow when you incorporate under the Societies Act. When you're applying for charitable status with the Canada Revenue Agency, you have fewer options. The permitted purposes are relief of poverty, advancement of education, advancement of religion, and other purposes that don't fall under these three, but that the courts have deemed beneficial to the community. That does open up a few other possibilities, but it is dependent on what courts have decided are good charitable and worthy charitable purposes. So it is different. There is incorporation as a society and a separate application for registration as a charity with Canada Revenue Agency. Being a charity is not the same as being incorporated. Please note that in this slide, we are talking about being registered as a charity under the Canada Revenue Agency registration, which is a federal legislation. And it is different from the Alberta Charitable Fundraising Act that we chatted about earlier. The names might have some similarities, but they are different. So far, we've been talking about legislation, but let's continue or walk down the ladder and go into the next piece, which is regulations. You might see or hear somebody say, we need to follow this regulation. Regulations are the rules that address the details and practical applications of the legislation. Regulations typically provide information about how to interpret and use the legislation that they are related to. They help clarify what the legislation says and how to use the legislation in practice. In other words, a regulation is a way to make the legislation clearer. Also, just like legislation, regulations have the full force of law. We do not go into too much detail on regulations here. However, depending on the work that your nonprofit organization does and the legislation that applies to you, you must follow several regulations as well. So far, I was discussing the external rules of the organization. Now I'm going to talk about the internal rules of the organization. They are the rules that your organization makes itself, and they include objects, bylaws, policies, and procedures. So what are internal rules? In addition to following the federal and provincial rules, your organization has to follow its own rules, and those are the internal rules. They include objects, bylaws, policies, and procedures, and also the motions passed by the board. Although motions may not seem like legal documents, they are in fact legal documents because they are decisions of the board and they should be followed. It is important to know that if you fail to follow your own rules, it may lead to claims for damages and even personal claims against board members. If you don't follow your internal rules, it's as if you're not aware of your own internal rules, or it appears that you're not acting in the best interest of your organization. So familiarize yourself with your internal rules and make sure that other board members know what they are as well. You should also communicate them to the membership and to your staff and volunteers as well. Good communication really helps to spread the word about these documents and decreases the likelihood of successful claims against the organization. Let's start with objects. Objects are short statements that describe the ultimate purpose of the organization. When you're developing objects of your organization, you should try to have a balance. What this means is that you want them to be short but broad in scope, while being specific enough to avoid ambiguity and uncertainty. You don't want them to create confusion within the organization. For example, a statement in the objects could be about what geographical area your organization is going to operate in. If the organization was in a specific city or town, a clear geographic boundary for the organization could be added to the objects to make that clear. What are bylaws? Bylaws are the governing rules and regulations of your organization. They describe the membership, how your organization will be managed, and how decisions will be made in your organization. You can see a few different pieces of bylaws in the image on the slide. For example, an important part of bylaws is describing your membership. You may also want to have something about your meetings, how your organization will call meetings, how many people will be present at the meetings or quorum, and the voting rights of its members. A good way to think about bylaws is to think of a house. The bylaws would be the frame of your house. The wooden frame of a house is the bylaws. So the same way that the frame of a house gives general shape and structure of the house, the bylaws give you the frame of how the organization is going to work and how it is structured. You may not want them to be too specific or detailed. In your toolkit, there is a good worksheet that breaks down and provides some more information about what you might want to include in your bylaws. What is policy? Policies are the basis of operations secondary to objects and the organization's bylaws. In the previous slide, I compared the bylaws to the wooden frame of the house. Now, everything that you do inside the house, such as decorations in the different rooms, the walls, the paint, etc., those are the policies and procedures. Policies include the organization's mission, vision, goals, and objectives. They often provide parameters or conditions that guide the actions of the board. Board policies can speak to term limits and can provide information about the work that committees, staff, and volunteers do. Policies can also describe in detail the roles and responsibilities of board members, committee positions, staff positions, and volunteer positions. What are procedures? Procedures are essentially instructions on how to carry out a policy. Anyone in the organization can write procedures, but I suggest that it is helpful to have the people involved in carrying out the policy to write its procedures, or at least be involved in writing them. So who makes what? Different people are involved in creating these internal documents, and again, I'm using the Societies Act as a guide for this graphic. Usually, the first board members create the objects and bylaws. They need to create them because they are required documents for the incorporation process. After incorporation is complete, the membership of the organization gets involved in the process. The membership approves any changes to objects and bylaws, and they also elect the board members that approve policies. The membership approves any changes to objects and bylaws. Keep in mind that when membership approves the changes to objects and bylaws, the board has to submit them to corporate registry. The changes are not finalized until you receive the approved documents from corporate registry. The membership also elects board members, giving them the authority to approve policies. What is our Constitution? There are different statutes in Alberta, but with the Societies Act, your constitutional documents are the combination of both the objects and bylaws. They are separate documents, but when you say Constitution, you're actually referring to both of those documents. How do the pieces fit together? As you look at the ladder of authority graphic, you can clearly see the external rules and the internal rules that board members need to be familiar with, what those documents are, and who has the authority for creating them. Keep in mind that these documents on the ladder have a relationship, that a document on the lower step cannot contradict any document on a higher step. So, for example, you cannot have anything in your policies that contradicts your bylaws, your objects, regulations, or legislation. Also, the documents at the top inform what might be needed in the documents below them. So in the example of policies, you could look to bylaws to decide what additional information and details are needed to be clarified in your policies. The more familiar you are with these legal documents, the more you will understand what rules your organization has and how your organization should get its work done. This brings us to the end of our video on understanding your legal landscape. Thank you for watching. Our contact information is on the slide and they are in the toolkit as well. If you are in Alberta and you have a question, you need further information, or would like to request services, you can contact us through our email and phone. You can also access our website to know more about our resources and services. And also, if you want to be informed of our future services and resources, you could add your email address to our subscription form, and you will receive information about our services and resources as they become available. The link to the subscription form is in the description of the video as well. Thank you for your attention. Take care, stay healthy, and as always, remember that our communities have so much more because of everything you do. Thank you all, and bye for now.